Okay, so something about the teachings in Dharamsala. His Holiness was giving some teachings on chapter 4 of the Madhyama Karikas, Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way, or sometimes it's called Root Wisdom. And so chapter 24 is quite a wonderful chapter. It talks about, it's a chapter on the Four Noble Truths, and it explains how, because everything is a dependent arising, then everything exists. Because everything is a dependent arising, it is empty. And thus, because things are empty and dependent arising, and those two are compatible. Yeah. So it, in that way, shows that because things are empty, then the two truths exist, then the Four Noble Truths exist, then everything can exist. And if nothing were empty, if everything inherently existed, nothing whatsoever could exist. So it's this brilliant chapter, and I remember the first time I heard teachings on it, it was like, whammo, this is how you prove that things exist. Because I had always had the question about how do we know the three jewels exist? You know, like, how do we know there's a Buddha? How do I know there's a Buddha? You know? Am I just taking somebody else's word for it? How do I know that the Buddha exists? And this chapter is what really did it for me, you know, because Nagarjuna really shows that because things are empty, then everything is possible and everything exists. And it's just brilliant. So while teaching that chapter, His Holiness stopped particularly at two verses, verse 18 and 19. And you might have remembered when Geshe Damdol Namgyal was here, he mentioned these two verses, and he asked us at that time to memorize them. And so I've been trying to think up a nice chant for them that would help us memorize them. Oh, which reminds me, another thing His Holiness told us in the South was when we come across quotations that we find very inspiring, especially about emptiness, to write them down. And it's interesting because I had already started last year. I had wanted to make for the Abbey like just a little book, a little booklet of good quotations. So I had started gathering ones. And these two verses were two of the ones that were in my little thing. And then when His Holiness said, you should do that, I thought, oh, okay. And then, you know, when he taught this, he went into some depth about it. And then he also gave some instructions about how to integrate it with our tantric practice. So it might take a few days to explain, but I'll get to that. And it's really brilliant. And I will, we can post it too so that everybody can copy the verses and then memorize them. And it would be nice to develop a really nice melody so that we can chant them together, kind of a slow melody so that we can chant them and contemplate while we're chanting. Okay, so I'll read the two verses first. That which is dependent arising is explained to be emptiness. That, being a dependent designation, is itself the middle way. There does not exist anything that is not dependently arisen. Therefore, there does not exist anything that is not empty. Okay. This also is relating to when Jeffrey was talking to us about emptiness being the meaning of dependent arising. Okay, so let's go to the first verse. That which is dependent arising is explained to be emptiness. Okay, that being a dependent designation is itself the middle way. Okay, so this is This verse introduces the final thought of the Buddha, in that things are dependent arising, which means dependently established or dependently designated. Okay, so the Buddha had taught different levels of dependent arising, but here he's really going to the deepest level, that of dependent designation. So when he says at the beginning, that which is the first line, that which is dependent arising, there he's explaining dependence on causes and conditions. And that pertains to all the Buddhist traditions except that. Yeah? I mean, that's kind of the Buddha's slogan, that things, functioning things, so not every phenomena, because permanent things don't depend on causes and conditions, but functioning things do. Okay? And so the meaning of depending on conditions is the meaning of the emptiness of inherent existence. Okay? So when things depend on conditions, that is leading you into emptiness. Because things depend on conditions, they are empty. So, this relates to the three principal aspects of the path. Yeah, when we're chanting it, and when he says, somebody who has realized the cause and effect of all phenomena has entered into the path which pleases the Buddha. So that's when you're first getting an understanding of dependent arising. You're meditating on how, because things are causally dependent on causes and conditions, therefore they are empty. Right? Yeah? Okay. So this refutes the lower schools that say, okay, but so the meaning of depending on conditions is the meaning of inherent existence. Okay? So this is something that is not accepted by all the Buddhist schools. Because remember that the lower schools, everybody but the Madhyamakas, say that if it's dependent, it's got to be inherently existent. Yeah, because if it didn't inherently exist, it wouldn't exist at all. Yeah, so actually even the Svatantrika Madhyamakas say that. Yeah, remember that? You've heard this in teachings, yeah? That if the lower schools say things have got to be inherently existent, because if they were just, if they were completely empty, then they there would be nothing there. Yeah, so this refutes the lower schools saying that if something is a dependent arising, it can't be empty. Because Narayana is saying, if it is a dependent arising, it must be empty. Okay? And so when we're first negating inherent existence, we start with meditating on dependency on causes and conditions as a reason to negate inherent existence. But we progress after that to meditating on dependent designation and seeing actually that if things are produced by causes and conditions, they're empty. And if they're empty and they're still existing, then the only way they could exist is by dependent designation. And if they're dependently designated, then they're empty. And dependent designation, unlike dependence on causes and conditions, includes permanent phenomena, because permanent phenomena are also dependently designated, and they also depend on their parts. Okay? So we start out with causal dependence, go to emptiness, see that if things are empty, they've got to exist by dependent designation, and then that includes, of course, permanent phenomena. So quite interesting. His saying this also refutes those that say that if things are empty, then causality can't function. So this is what some of the people in the lower school say. Oh, you're saying things are empty, they have no true existence, then they just can't function at all, which means things are non-existent. Okay? Because if you think about it, if things only exist by independence on terms and concepts, you can't get a handle on them, can you? Yeah, they're like, it seems like they're all made up by mind. Yeah, I mean, that's why Jeffrey was saying that actually the Prakasangikas are more mind only than the Chittamatrans are. Because the Chittamatrans assert true existence and the Prasangika says, no, everything's made up by the mind. But the lower schools freak out and they say, if everything's made up by the mind, then you can call everything, anything, and everything totally falls apart. Yeah, you can't establish anything that way, because it's all just, what I feel like labeling it, or what I think in one day or another. And you will find people who misunderstand emptiness in this way. Yeah. And they're the people who say, oh, everything is empty, there's no good, there's no bad, you can do whatever you want. Okay, so they go to the nihilistic view, whereas if you really understand that things are dependent, it makes you have more respect for causality, more respect for the functioning, the law of karma and its effects. Okay, so saying that emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising doesn't mean emptiness is the definition of dependent arising. Does this sound familiar? Okay, if it did, then the same mind that realized a dependent arising would realize emptiness. Yeah, and seeing something that, seeing that something is a flat-bottom, bulbous-based water holder doesn't mean you've realized emptiness. Okay? Okay. When you ascertain things that are dependently arisen because they depend on causes and conditions, as a result of that very cognitive process, okay, here we're talking about people who have already realized emptiness. Remember what Jeffrey cognized when you're talking about saying emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. It refers to people who've already realized emptiness, and they've realized emptiness by realizing that because things are causally dependent, they're empty. Okay, so here we're linking, causal dependence to emptiness. So then those people who have at least inferentially refuted inherent existence, okay, when they ascertain that things are dependently arisen because they depend on causes and conditions, as a result of that very cognitive process, they ascertain the emptiness of inherent existence. Okay, they realize that inherent existence means independence from others. Okay, and that existing independent from others and existing dependent on others are contradictory. Okay, so then they realize that everything exists dependently. Okay, but here it's going to be dependent designation. They realize that things exist according to dependent designation. So for someone who has ascertained emptiness, when they see, hear, or remember that things are dependent on causes and conditions, then they should contemplate that for that very reason they are empty. Okay? If you do so, even though you aren't taught about emptiness directly, just through the teaching of dependent arising, the latent potentials for understanding emptiness will be activated in future lives. Okay? So, if you're somebody in this life who's realized emptiness, and then realized that emptiness means, that inherent existence means independence from others. So emptiness means the lack of independence from others, which means things are dependently arising. Okay, so if you've understood that this lifetime, then very deeply understood this, then in your future lives, yeah, even if somebody doesn't teach you about emptiness directly, just through hearing about dependent arising, yeah, the latency for understanding emptiness will ripen, and you'll be able to realize emptiness easily. That would be nice, huh? Yeah. They say that some people, when they hear about emptiness, they get really afraid. And other people, when they hear about emptiness, they feel a lot of joy, so that the hair in the body stands on end. So it kind of indicates a little bit, what kind of imprints we have from a previous life. If we go, oh, empty, nothing exists, I don't exist. Or if you go empty, oh my goodness, this is going to be a relief. And you feel quite happy about it. Okay? So I think, again, in some ways, I'm going off on a little tangent. This is showing why purification and accumulation of merit are so important. Because without them, we're just always grasping at inherent existence. So anything that threatens that grasping is scary to us. Whereas if we do a lot of purification and creation of merit, then we understand the Dharma better. Then when we hear about emptiness, it makes some sense, and our mind relaxes because we see that emptiness is going to bring us a relief from suffering. Yeah. So it comes true too also that when you meditate deeply and really see ignorance as the cause of your suffering, and how grasping at true existence causes your suffering, then when you hear about something that counteracts that, that's going to do away with the ignorance, you feel really happy. So when you hear that things, aren't inherently existent, and there's a wisdom that, can abolish your grasping at them, you go, oh, yippee, that's what I've been looking for. Whereas when you don't have a lot of purification and accumulation of merit, when you haven't studied and don't have those kind of seeds in your mind, then you hear about that and the mind goes, no, if it exists dependent on causes and conditions, it must inherently exist, because otherwise it doesn't exist at all. Yeah, and Jay Rinpoche says this is the beauty of the Prasangika approach, is that the very reason that the lower schools give to prove inherent existence is what the Prasangikas give to prove emptiness, dependent arising. Okay? So, line 3, that being a dependent designation is itself the middle way. So dependent designation here means emptiness. It doesn't mean non-existence. So everything is dependently designated. And in dependence on others, everything has its identity. So His Holiness always talks about that when we talk about causal dependence, we say the effect depends on the cause, right? But we don't say the cause depends on the effect, because the cause came first, the effect came later. So in causal dependence, the dependence is only one way. The effect depends on the cause. But as your understanding progresses, you come to think about mutual dependence or relational dependence. And you see that also the cause depends on the effect, because for something to be a cause, there has to be an effect or a potential effect to it. We can't call something a seed unless there's the potential for a plant or a sprout or something to grow. You don't call somebody a child unless there's parents, and you don't call somebody parents unless they have children. Okay? So this isn't just in terms of terminology, but it's actually like the seed's identity. It's being able to be called a cause depends on there being the potential for sprouts. So there you have the cause being dependent on the effect. Not because the effect creates the cause, but because those two things exist in relation to each other. Okay? So that's a deeper level of dependence that we're getting into here. Okay? And then, when he says that being a dependent designation is itself the middle way, what he's getting at is that actions can't be performed and results experienced when things are inherently existent. Yeah, because causality doesn't work. Because inherent existence means independence from everything else. So if something exists independently, it not only is independent of causes, but it also is independent of designation and concept and everything. It exists out there as its own self-enclosed reality. And that's how we feel about ourselves sometimes, don't we? I am a self-enclosed reality. I am here. There's this big I, and it's here. And it's its own self-enclosed reality. Yeah, the universe starts with me. And it ends with me. Okay, so actions are performed in dependence on other factors, so they have no essence. So that is the middle way. It's the middle way between inherent existence and non-existence. Or what we say, the middle way between absolutism and nihilism. So emptiness itself is the middle way. It's not inherently existent, it's not non-existent. Okay, and it doesn't mean things, phenomena inherently exist, and it doesn't mean they don't exist. So emptiness itself is the middle way. That's something really to contemplate. Yeah? Because in the last, second to the last verse, I think it is, of Three Principles, when he talks about, how is it? Mm-hmm. In addition, appearances clear away the extreme of inherent existence. Emptiness clears away the extreme of non-existence. When you understand the arising of cause and effect from the viewpoint of emptiness, you are not captivated by either extreme view. Okay? So usually we think of emptiness as counteracting inherent existence, and dependent arising as counteracting non-existence. But that verse, he's talking about emptiness is actually counteracting non-existence, and dependent arising is counteracting inherent existence. It's kind of the opposite from what how you think of it earlier. Okay. Anyway, there's a lot to say on that, so we'll continue tomorrow. And if it's not clear, that's because it's difficult material, and I probably am not explaining it as clearly as it could be explained. But we try, yeah.
The emptiness of the lower schools, is it considered emptiness of inherent existence, or do they just
No.
have a void?
No, when the lower schools speak of emptiness, okay, first of all, like the Vaibhasikas and Sautrantikas, they usually speak of selflessness. They don't speak so much of emptiness. The Chitta-Madhyans bring in more. I mean, the Vaibhasikas and Sautrantika have some mention of emptiness, but they really use the word selflessness much more. The Chitta-Madhyans bring in the word emptiness. But remember, for them, emptiness means that something doesn't exist by its own characteristics as the referent of the term, and doesn't exist as a different substantial entity from the consciousness perceiving it. So how they define emptiness is different than how the Prasangikas defined it. Similarly, how the Svatantrika Madhyamikas define emptiness is different than how the Prasangikas define it. Okay? So again, the word is the same, the definitions are different, the meaning is different. Yeah?